the literalness,
Yeah.
science gives us the truth. It's sort of that message that
Yeah.
I'm concerned with. I just wonder
Yeah.
if you would comment on those issues.
Well, the story definitely will change, the details. There are certain basic outlines. In fact, the sequence of transformative episodes is not likely to change. And how these are articulated will certainly change. And so our story is the mythic dimension. So any story has a mythic aspect to it. So in that sense, this fulfills the role of our modern myth. But it does have the empirical basis more clearly than other stories. And it's just so remarkably perceptive because so much of the data, while certain things will change, just an enormous amount of it will not change substantially. It may come into a different context. But the fact that there is a coherence to the universe, that there is a unity, that things are related to each other, as we have it in general, I think is sufficient. But we need a mystique that the story itself gives, and that story, although certain details, like any religious tradition, its bases are constantly changing in certain sense. Everything human changes constantly. Yeah.
I have the feeling, thank you for that presentation, but I was thinking about education in this, and I was thinking about how you were, although you were sort of joking about going from 5 to 4 to 3, I can't help but think that we must think about lifelong learning when we do this, and how do we empower every child to have a Montessori experience? Because what I hear you talking about is very much facilitating the child to be able, any child, every child, anywhere in the world, to be able to have this context of the global look and the global thinking, which many of us have tried to do in our own way, to get rid of some of the boundaries, to make it an essence of learning.
Yeah.
And yet, we now live to be 100. It's very hard to pay attention to all of these things. And yet I can't help but think education is still the clue. I'm not so sure, though, when I hear you speak, that we should concentrate completely at the university level,
No.
but rather our responsibility of that education. How can we, whether it be the elders or whether it be the schools or whether it be the parents or what it is, you seem to have defined it better than I've ever heard it defined before.
Yeah. Well, it needs to be told in 1,000 different ways. 1,000 different ways.
Same respect.
The same basic account. And I was at a Montessori school a year or so ago, and 2 third graders took me out in the corridor, and they unrolled this tape. There weren't any markings on the tape, but they showed me, if this were all time, here's where the galaxies come in, and the supernova, and the sun, and the solar system, and life. They told me the whole thing, 3rd graders. Now, but they were secure in having a story. Now, any story is constantly being renewed and told afresh. Every telling is different. But there is Virginia Lee Burton wrote Life Story, which was a very good telling about 25 years ago. But now to know why the Earth, if all the planets were the same originally, Mars turned to rock, Jupiter is gaseous, nothing solid on the surface, maybe a solid core, but substantially nothing solid. The Earth. Why is it that the Earth was the only one to have life? And it's, well, the answer is to a certain extent, it lies in the radius of the Earth, that it had the sufficient gravitational pressure to break down the radioactive, to create the radioactive atmosphere at the center that would create the volcanic explosions that would give us air and water and so forth. It's a turbulent process. It's a controlled turbulence, just as an exquisite poise in that balance. And then again, it was, I call it a moment of grace, when if the moon were a little closer to the Earth, the tides would overwhelm the continents. A little more distant, the seas would be stagnant, nothing would happen. And so this remarkable thing, this, I think, constitutes such wonderful things to know about, and particularly for children to begin to get a feel for that they're on a very special place, a very special planet, that it has a mystique to it and a wonder.
Universe stories constructed from.
Well, let me say this. Everything that's intelligible has a psychic dimension. The pure matter is nothing. Everything has form. St. Thomas mentioned that's the divine element in things, is form. And that is the intelligibility of it. Now, it's something like, but it's a that intelligibility requires a psychic component in the structure of the thing. But it's known simply by intelligence, something like that is the ultimate form. It's like an acorn that it makes the oak tree. The scientists can write DNA and write all the formula for all that, but what it cannot do is write the formula for the governing principle that holds all that together and enables it to send down roots, raise the trunk, do these vast number of complexity of things in an organized, interrelated manner. Now, there's no formula for that. There's no way in which you can get it by any sense. You can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't touch it, but you know that there is what we call the soul. That is what would be the form of any living organic body we call a soul. That's the anima. That's why when Descartes reduced the universe to mind an extension, he wiped out the soul, and he de-souled the world, and explained this coordinationism, that God somehow had the coordination between the mind and what was happening out there in extension and in matter. But this question of the psychic component is contained primarily in ordered relationships that exist throughout the universe.
Can I just leapfrog on this, because it's the same issue, if I could?
Real quick.
Yes.
Yeah.
I really think this is the point, because as you know, I agree with everything
Yeah.
you say, but as you know perfectly well, there are millions of people in this world who absolutely deny what you're saying and who expect to explain everything that you just talked about as a psychic mystical process in purely materialistic reductionist terms.
Yeah,
And
I
are
know
we,
that.
in some sense, serving their goals by using the strictly scientific story and using all the data and the evidence from science?
Well, they may use it any way they want, but the fact is that they have no explanation of how we come into the picture.
But this isn't the first time in history that religious and spiritually oriented people have claimed that science cannot explain this, and
Well,
they've gone on
well,
to explain it.
I know. Well, there's a
And as long
difference.
as you deal with the gaps that science
Okay.
leaves out, you're going to fall into that trap.
Well, I don't know if it's a trap, but it's a difference. Difference, they either accept it or they don't. There's no way in which a person can convince them that.
Okay.
Well, what I want to say is that
Thank you.
the story that incorporates the greatest amount of at least acceptable data, or if we just grant the idea that there is no story, that everybody, this is up for grabs and everything is no story, well, that's not going to be very helpful for us, I don't think. We say there are just 1,000 different things, that it's too varied and all that, so that we just can't say anything about the universe. So in between just not saying anything and being able to tell something that's not simply a kind of a dream story, but something that is founded in basic empirical data. The account that assembles the most amount of that in an acceptable way, I think, becomes very, very important. Not that it's an absolute that can't be touched, it can be modified here and there and everything. And so the basic, we need something to be able to be coherent. So, yeah, that's it.
Or something.
Yeah.
I find your story, the story that Western culture.
Well, this doesn't disturb any of the stories that the mythic stories. This is.
It's a poor story.
Pardon?
But it's a poor story.
Oh, I think it's a magnificent story. The story of the stars, the story of the galaxies, the stories of the shaping of the planets. It's a stupendous story.
Why have
But-
you speak through empirical data?
It's because this validates the material world, because the material world is consubstantial with the spirit world.
I agree, but that's not the only way to validate the material world. It's a way which
Well,
has been destructive.
say that is a way, but that's what I'm saying. It is the way in which we have senses. We have senses to see, to hear, and there's nothing in our minds that's not first in our senses.
But my senses are so much richer than that, with
Well,
all kinds of images
well-
and feelings that other stories capture so much better.
Well, I don't
Well,
think that-
all right for you, but I would still
These
say
are not
that.
mutually exclusive. David.
Yeah.
I like your story. I'm going to go back to an earlier point. You began by describing the pathologies of Western civilization. We might put in its place, or how might we reform it so that it could be a storytelling culture?
Well, first of all, this is something that should be in the social order and to the topocultural order. For instance, one of the things that I think is most important is not to put children in the classroom and give them an alphabet and teach them literacy. I much prefer that they become literate as regards trees, as regards grass, as regards water, as regards soil, that they become literate as regards the universe around them, that they learn the stars and all of this. Now, then they can learn an alphabet, and then they can begin reading the human language. But the important thing for me is that they recognize that the stars are the primary communication, or that the trees, that the natural world is our primary experience, and that the book world or the school world or the university world is a very secondary thing. So that in all of this, it's a question of how to achieve our multiple selves. That is, I would say this, we have a personal self, we have a family self, we have our community self, a nation self, a human self, an earth self, a universe self. Because it has taken, as Carl Sagan says, it takes 14 billion years to make apple pie. Now, and the physicists tell us that it takes 14 billion years for humans to come into being the way we are, and that we fit perfectly into this type of a universe. There's a coherence between, that's a wonderful thing, I think. There's a wonderful coherence between the universe and this total process and the moment when we come into being. Now, this, I think that's stupendous, and that's why I think that we had to have a world as beautiful as the late Cenozoic period for humans to come into being, because our intelligence needed, the burden of intelligence is such that we need a beautiful world, or else we can't carry out the burden of intelligence. Now, I think that's a stupendous thing to understand, how we relate, and that's one of the things that science tells us in our universe in the moment we come into being. Now, when we violate the condition, in other words, it's not by chance that we come into being now rather than some other time, because the whole human process supposes this type of a situation. And we are keyed to this. We are keyed to the stars, not to the computer. Now this, so that if we destroy or distort the context that we are made for, then we still have the longing for that. But it can never be satisfied adequately because we've destroyed the need that we have, the fulfillment we have distorted, and therefore I think that's one way of accounting for the psychic difficulties that we're having in our times. So this relationship to the story is such that we, to my mind, we need this awareness of the amount of time that it took for us to come into being, the conditions and so forth, so that we could fulfill the role that we're made for.
Okay, we've got Dieter, Larry, Mary Elizabeth, Inez, Roger.
I'll make it real quick. Some of us gathered at Meadow Creek a couple of years ago and discussed the common story, creation stories are supposed to answer.
Yeah.
Where did we come from? Who are we? Why are we so messed up?
Yeah.
And what do we do now to save ourselves? And that's what those stories are all about. And you need these other stories.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with that, but this is one thing, because this story cannot be told by any one telling or any one person or group of persons or whatever. This story, it's told in a different way by a bluebird than it is by an oak tree. But these both tell the story of the universe. Now, and the human telling would necessarily take various forms. But one of the things that I think is so important, that the basic pattern of this be recognized as sacred story. Now, not that it is not amenable to change and that it cannot be told differently. It can be told differently. But there is this sense of a sequence of transformation episodes that move in general from the less to greater complexity of structure, from lesser to greater consciousness, and to lesser to greater freedom in general. That's evolution moves back and forward in every way. But in the overarching context, something of that nature could be said, but that's not. So I think that's essential to our modern sense of the universe, because no matter how it's told, I think some of those ideas are preserved. But the main thing is we need to have a sacred story for our civilization. And I don't think that the Genesis story is an adequate story, because it doesn't give us a sacred universe. And that is the issue with me, is that this story that tells us the story of the universe has a sacred dimension. Because if we don't have a sense of a sacred universe, then nothing is sacred. And if nothing is sacred, then everything is up for grabs.
Okay, Larry.
Bring out some basic thoughts as regards the story. But what I think is most important in this is that humans need to recognize that the larger community, that the human is subservient to the larger community, that the human is derivative, and that its norm of fulfillment is larger than itself. And that that's why I talk about sacred story, is that we need to have an awareness that that the universe is all I call a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, and that this development is something that we are subservient to, and that we are not the masters of. And we do have a role to play, but as long as it's understood that this is that we have an integral relationship with that nature.
Okay.
All this, and something's
We have this monumental amount of scientific data
right.
as regards the universe. And that knowledge is enabling us to devastate the planet. And we have to bring that knowledge into some coherent meaning in relationship to ourselves. Now, this is not to say that there's simply one comprehensive story, but it is to say that if this data is left to be utilized in this devastating way, it's going to just ruin everything. And it is ruining everything. Unless that story, unless that data is brought into some coherent, and I think it is, because it does give us a way of reading in the stars, read the story in the star. Everything tells the story in the scientific world. Every part of the universe is immediately present to every other part of the universe, and it tells us the unity of the universe. It tells us in a special way, in the scientist way, and this is not to say that the way that different indigenous peoples have, all those stories, they're very necessary. You can't do without them. They're more important. Children need those local stories, too. But when a person begins to participate in this modern world with all these forces loose, we've got to deal with this amount of data.
Well, I'm aware that having been educated in a university,
Yeah.
which I'm still trying to unlearn a lot of the things
Yeah.
that I was forced to learn, creates a real dilemma.
Yeah.
And in order for there to be sacred story, there has to be the belief that there is such a thing as sacred thought. and sacred language, because it's through language that we create the story. And I think the biggest problem that we have today is that we don't have the language to create that story,
Yeah.
because we're being driven by multinational corporations who are really calling the shots.
Well,
Yes.
that's because the religious people have not been able to understand this in a meaningful way, and to provide a meaningful context in which to deal with it. The scientific language is sacred to any other language, and so that the sense of the universe as carrying this amount of mystery. Science hasn't resolved mysteries. It's brought about a deeper understanding, a deeper statement of the mystery of things. So it's not that it's going to explain everything to us, but it leads us deeper into the mystery of things.
It's going to be difficult to sleep tonight. But on the other hand, I can make an apple pie in 4 hours.
Well, it took the universe 15 billion years to make you.
Okay, we have Roger and Glenn, and maybe we'll wrap it up soon.
Okay, well, I
Well, in some ways, it gives us greater power. It gives us power that the other doesn't. It gives us
may control this.
it gives us a new comprehensiveness of things that the other can't do. So, okay,
I want
what you
you
were
to
saying.
say that maybe your story is a nice addition, but it can't be the story. It probably can't even be a very.
I'm not
vibrant
saying
story.
it's the story. I'm saying that it is a needed story. It is the prevalent story of our times. It's our way of identifying ourselves where we are in time and space. If you want to identify where we are in time and space, this is the way you tell it. You tell it that we are belong to the terminal phase of the Cenozoic period. We come, and the whole thing works out this way. That's the reality of contemporary mode of consciousness, and our whole educational system is based on that.
But it might not be where I come from. That
Well,
might be very alienating.
Well, that's you may be self-alienating, but but let's go on.
Okay. Thomas is saying over and over again, this is a context. It is not the answer. It is not the story. It is not a definitive packaged program. And I appreciated some of what Mary Elizabeth was trying to say, that this, I think, in a certain sense, is the beginning of some of the paradigm shifts, and all of that is plural, that is taking place in our time, that will have a critical interaction, that will have enormous effects on curriculum, on the university, etc. But I think that what Thomas has put before us, in many senses, is one of the most challenging, even in its comprehensive dimensions, one of the most challenging contexts for rethinking this higher education paradigm problem project that is ahead of us. So I think that what we have to do is invite ourselves into further discussion of the kinds of critiques that will come from theology, that will come from philosophy and various disciplines, to interact with a very powerful sensibility and story that is being emerging in our times. So having said that, if you have anything to add, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll call it to a conclusion.
Well, I really don't have much further to say, but the university at the present time, I think that this is the context in which the university is functioning at the present time, that it could not exist at the present time in any other context. It would not be coherent outside of this story of this a certain period of time, whether it's 10 billion or 14 billion, that's not the point. but without this sense of this long period of emergent evolutionary process. I don't know if there's any way in which a contemporary university could exist unless it just cut out the whole of modern knowledge and went into poetry and maybe human history or any of that, but it would not be able to function, and as far as I know. But the question is, though, that it's our effort to read the story in the universe about us, and that the universe bears the impress somehow, despite a lot of differences, of this long period of time of transformation episodes, and that we are, I think, graced by this story. It doesn't eliminate any. All the poets need to keep writing their poetry. The indigenous peoples, their stories are enormously important. And we need to continue to do certain things. But if we don't bring this knowledge into some coherent context, then I think that we're not going to ever deal effectively with this, the way in which humans relate to the planet. Well, thank you.